The night Graham Ashford left, the house did not shake with shouting. It simply went quiet, in a way Amara Whitfield had never heard before, a silence so complete she could hear the refrigerator humming 2 rooms away. There was no scene, no broken glass, no dramatic slamming of doors. There was only a suitcase disappearing from the closet, a row of empty hangers swinging slightly on the rod, and a man she had loved for 16 years standing in the doorway of their bedroom like a stranger who had wandered in by mistake. He told her the marriage had grown stale, that something inside him had gone quiet years ago, and he had only now found the courage to admit it. He told her about Sienna Vale, a woman 19 years younger, as though he were confessing something noble rather than something cruel. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words themselves were sharp enough. "She makes me feel young again," he said, and Amara felt something crack quietly inside her chest, not loudly, not violently, just a slow fracture spreading through years of trust. It was not the affair that hurt most. It was the ease with which he said it, as if her 42 years of devotion had simply become an inconvenience he was finally free to discard. He told her she had grown rigid, too independent, too settled into a life that no longer excited him. He said Sienna understood him in ways Amara never had, as if understanding were something that could be measured against youth rather than years of shared history. Amara did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with Graham when his mind was made up only fed his certainty. She asked him one question, quietly, without tears in her voice. "When did you decide this?" Graham paused, just long enough for the answer to matter more than the words themselves. "A long time ago," he said, 2 words that unraveled everything she thought she understood about the life they had built together. If it had been a long time, then every dinner, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning had been built on top of a lie he had already decided to tell. She thought of the early years, when Graham used to leave notes tucked into her briefcase before important meetings, small reminders that someone believed in her. She thought of the man who had once driven 3 hours through a snowstorm because she mentioned, offhand, that she missed her mother's cooking and wanted him to meet the woman who raised her. That man seemed to have disappeared so gradually that Amara had never noticed the exact moment he left. Perhaps, she thought now, he had been gone for years before his body finally followed. She watched him zip the suitcase, watched him check his reflection in the hallway mirror as though this were an ordinary departure rather than the end of a marriage. He straightened his collar the way he always did before an important meeting, as if leaving her required the same polish as closing a business deal. At the door, he turned back, and for a moment, Amara thought perhaps some remnant of the man she had married might surface, some flicker of guilt or hesitation. Instead, his voice dropped into something colder, more deliberate than anything he had said all evening. "Do not go digging through my finances, Amara," he told her. "It will only make things harder for you." Then he left, the door clicking shut with a softness that felt more menacing than any slam could have been. Amara stood in the hallway long after his car pulled out of the driveway, turning his final words over in her mind. She had said nothing about finances. She had not even thought about it. So why had he felt the need to warn her against something she had never mentioned? In the days that followed, Amara found herself doing something she had never done before in 16 years of marriage. She began looking, really looking, at the architecture of the life they had built. She thought of the business trips that always seemed to multiply toward the end of each quarter. She thought of the bank statements Graham handled personally, the accounts he managed under the explanation that he simply preferred to handle the numbers so she would not have to worry. She had believed him because believing him had always been easier than questioning him. Graham had built himself into a man people trusted instinctively, a small investment firm executive with a handshake that closed rooms and a smile that opened them. Their house was beautiful. Their cars were new every few years. Their dinners were the kind that came with wine lists instead of menus. She had lived inside that image for so long she had stopped noticing it was an image at all. There had been moments, small ones, that Amara had brushed aside without much thought at the time. A colleague of Graham's who once made an offhand remark about how he admired Graham's ability to keep so many plates spinning at once. A dinner where a business partner had joked, half seriously, that Graham could sell sand to a man standing on a beach. She had laughed along with everyone else, never once considering that the joke might have been closer to the truth than anyone intended. She remembered, too, the way Graham had always insisted on handling the household investments himself, gently steering her away whenever she expressed interest in reviewing the portfolios. He would tell her she had enough on her plate, managing her own career, that he wanted to protect her from the tedious details of interest rates and quarterly statements. At the time, it had felt like consideration. Looking back now, it felt like something closer to control, a carefully maintained boundary, designed to keep her from ever seeing too much. When she finally sat down with the folder of household documents she had rarely touched, she found something strange tucked between mortgage papers and old tax filings. A property she had always believed belonged to both of them was, according to the paperwork, held under a company name she did not recognize. She stared at the unfamiliar name for a long time, trying to remember if Graham had ever mentioned it. He had not. She also found records of monthly payments that did not match anything she understood about their life together. Not a mortgage. Not a business expense, she recognized. One line, repeated month after month, read simply, "Personal guarantee." She did not know what it meant. Not precisely, but something about the phrase made her stomach tighten in a way she could not explain. Memories began surfacing, small ones she had never thought twice about. Graham asking her to sign papers he described as routine, necessary to finalize some loan or another for the business. She had signed without reading closely, because he had always told her the details were complicated and she trusted him to handle them. Now, she wondered exactly what she had agreed to without knowing. She called her attorney the following morning, a woman named Denise Coleman, who had handled small legal matters for her over the years. Amara brought copies of everything she had found, laying them across the desk with hands that had started, for the first time since Graham left, to tremble. Denise studied the documents in silence, flipping through pages with a focus that made Amara's chest tighten further. When Denise finally looked up, her expression had changed. "Amara," she said carefully, "there is something you need to know," Denise explained, in the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths, that some of the documents Graham had asked Amara to sign appeared connected to financial obligations of his company. It did not necessarily mean Amara was liable for everything attached to Graham's business, but it meant the picture was far more complicated than she had assumed. More troubling, Denise said, was the pattern itself. Graham had used the appearance of a stable marriage, a trustworthy partner, to build credibility with lenders and business partners alike. Over the following days, Amara combed through records with the same discipline she brought to corporate finance in her professional life. She found multiple loans stacked one on top of another. She found personal guarantees tied to business debts. She found accounts that seemed designed to shuffle money between entities rather than build anything lasting. Personal expenses blurred into company expenses until the line between them disappeared entirely. Denise recommended bringing in a forensic accountant, a quiet, methodical man named Walter Briggs, who had spent nearly 2 decades untangling exactly this kind of financial knot. Walter arrived with a laptop and a legal pad and asked Amara for every document she could find, no matter how insignificant it seemed. He warned her gently that the process would be slow, that these patterns rarely revealed themselves all at once, and that she needed to prepare herself for details that might be difficult to absorb. Amara appreciated his honesty more than she expected to. For years she had been surrounded by people who softened hard truths until they lost their shape entirely. Walter did not soften anything. Within the first week, he had already flagged a series of transfers that troubled him, movements of money between accounts that served no legitimate business purpose he could identify. He told her plainly that whatever she was looking at, it was larger and older than a few months of trouble. The most unsettling discovery was simple arithmetic. Graham owed more than several of his prized possessions were worth. The man who had built an image of effortless success was, underneath the surface, drowning in obligations he had never mentioned to her. Amara realized then that Graham had not simply left her for a younger woman. He might have been searching for someone new to help him sustain an illusion that was quietly collapsing. One evening, she opened an old box of letters from the early years of their marriage, love notes written before ambition had hardened into something else. She studied a photograph of Graham from those years, younger, softer around the eyes, and asked herself quietly whether she had ever truly known this man or only the version of him he had allowed her to see. An old email surfaced during her search, buried in an archived folder she rarely opened. The sender was a bank. The subject line read, "Final demand, personal guarantee." Amara stared at the figure listed beneath it, a number so large it did not seem to belong to the life she thought they had built together. She read it twice, certain she had misunderstood, but the number remained the same both times. Across town, in the luxury apartment Graham had rented for their new beginning, Sienna Vale was beginning to notice cracks of her own. In the beginning, she had believed she had won something rare, a successful man who had chosen her over a marriage he described as long dead. She believed his stories about a wife who did not understand him, who had grown distant and cold. She had no reason yet to question any of it. Then small inconsistencies began to appear. A credit card declined at a restaurant, quietly resolved with an embarrassed laugh. A payment on the apartment delayed by a week, then two. A phone call from the landlord that Graham took in another room, his voice low and clipped. A finance company reaching out about the car parked in their garage, requesting updated paperwork. Graham dismissed each incident the same way. Just a temporary issue, he told her, every time, until the phrase began to sound less like reassurance and more like a wall being built between them. When Sienna pressed for details, his patience thinned quickly. He accused her of not trusting him, of letting doubt poison something that could have been beautiful. Sienna had grown up watching her own mother struggle financially, after a divorce that left her with little more than debt and a broken sense of security. She had promised herself she would never again be the last person in a household to understand what was happening with the money. That promise, buried quietly for months beneath the excitement of a new relationship and a life that looked effortless from the outside, began to surface again with an urgency she could no longer ignore. She started paying closer attention to small details she had previously let pass unnoticed. The way Graham took certain calls in the bathroom with the faucet running, as if the sound of water might mask his voice. The way he changed the subject smoothly whenever she asked about his company's recent performance. The way his mood shifted, almost imperceptibly, whenever an unfamiliar number appeared on his phone screen. Alone one afternoon while Graham was out, Sienna opened a folder of documents he had left on the kitchen table, thinking little of it at first. What she found made her sit down slowly at the table, her pulse quickening. Graham's name appeared attached to loan after loan, obligation after obligation, far beyond anything he had ever described to her. And then, buried among the papers, another name appeared, Amara Whitfield. Sienna had imagined Amara, as Graham described her, a woman too rigid to understand a man like him, a marriage that had simply run its course. But staring at the documents in front of her, she began to wonder whether Amara was not the failed wife in this story, but rather someone caught in the middle of something far larger than a broken marriage. She found a financial summary tucked beneath the loan documents. The figure listed there did not match anything Graham had ever told her about his finances. It was larger, heavier, more frightening than the picture of comfortable success he had painted for her. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her phone and dialed his number. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. Determined now, Sienna searched further through the papers scattered across the table. Near the bottom of the stack, she found a document with Graham's signature at the top, and beneath it, a line she read 3 times before the meaning fully settled into her mind. Amara Whitfield, listed as guarantor. Sienna's breathing quickened. She understood enough about finance to know what that word meant, and the understanding terrified her. At 13 minutes past 2 in the morning, Amara's phone rang, the screen glowing bright against the darkness of her bedroom. An unfamiliar number. She almost let it ring through to silence, exhausted from weeks of sleepless nights and mounting discoveries. But something made her answer instead. A trembling voice asked if this was Amara. She recognized it instantly. Younger, uncertain, nothing like the confident woman she had imagined stealing her husband. "Why are you calling me?" Amara asked, her tone flat. guarded. On the other end, Sienna began to cry, her words tumbling out faster than she could control them. "Because I think he lied to both of us," Sienna said. Amara said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them like a held breath. Sienna continued, explaining what she had found. The loans, the guarantees, obligations, neither of them had agreed to knowingly. She admitted she had no idea how deep the debt truly ran, or how many documents carried her own name without her understanding what she had signed. "Please," Sienna said, her voice breaking, "I need you to tell me what you know." Amara did not soften immediately. The wound Graham had left was still too fresh, too raw, and this woman on the other end of the line represented everything that had broken her marriage apart. "Why should I believe you?" Amara asked, her voice steady despite the questions crowding her mind. "Because I found something with your signature," Sienna answered. A photograph followed, moments later, sent through to Amara's phone, an image of a document she did not immediately recognize. Amara stared at the signature, at the bottom of the page. It was hers, unmistakably, the same slanted letters she had written thousands of times, but she had no memory of signing this particular document, no recollection of the moment it captured. She zoomed in on the date printed near the top of the page, and a chill moved through her as she recognized it. She remembered that day precisely. Graham had told her they were visiting the bank to finalize paperwork for a property purchase, something simple, something she had trusted without question. But the document glowing on her screen had nothing to do with any property. It was something else entirely, something Graham had never explained. Amara sat up against the headboard, the glow of the phone the only light in the room, and asked Sienna to send whatever else she had found. Over the next hour, image after image arrived, each one adding another layer to a picture that grew more troubling with every message. Sienna explained, between quiet sobs, that she had confronted Graham with none of it yet, too frightened of what his reaction might be, too uncertain of what she would do once she knew the full truth. "There is a difference," Amara told her gently, "between being afraid of a person and being afraid of what a person might become once they realize you know everything." Sienna asked what that meant. Amara did not answer right away. She was thinking of her own 16 years, of every moment she had chosen comfort over confrontation, and she was not entirely sure she had earned the right to give advice on the subject yet. "Get some sleep," she finally said. "We will figure out what any of this means in the morning." Neither of them slept much that night. Amara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying years of small moments that now seemed to carry a different weight than she had ever assigned them. Across the city, Sienna sat curled on the edge of her bed, waiting for the sound of Graham's key in the door, no longer certain whether she wanted him to come home, or hoped, quietly, that he would not. Days later, the two women met in person for the first time, in a quiet coffee shop far from either of their homes. The air between them was thick with tension neither could fully name. Amara did not warm to Sienna easily, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. Sienna, for her part, carried a visible weight of guilt, aware that she had become the woman blamed for the collapse of a marriage she had not fully understood herself. Yet, as they began to talk, something unexpected emerged. Both women realized Graham had told each of them a different version of the truth, carefully shaped to serve whatever purpose he needed in that moment. Amara described 16 years of marriage, the trust she had extended without hesitation, the quiet assumption that her husband managed their finances responsibly because he had always told her so. Sienna described the version of Amara that Graham had painted for her, a woman controlling and cold, someone who had made his life smaller rather than larger. The two stories did not align. Graham had told Sienna that Amara controlled the money, yet Amara had barely been permitted to see the accounts. Graham had told Sienna that Amara never supported his ambitions, yet Amara had signed document after document at his request, never questioning the trust he claimed to place in her. At one point, Sienna set down her coffee cup and admitted something that seemed to cost her a great deal to say aloud. She confessed that Graham had told her, early in their relationship, that Amara was the reason his business had struggled in recent years, that her lack of support had held him back from opportunities he might otherwise have pursued. Amara absorbed this quietly, feeling something between anger and exhaustion settle in her chest. She had spent years, quietly covering household expenses whenever Graham claimed the business needed extra capital, never once receiving credit for the sacrifice, only blame disguised as disappointment. Sienna, watching Amara's expression shift, seemed to understand for the first time just how thoroughly she had been used as a tool in a story that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with maintaining an illusion. "I thought I was special," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I thought he chose me because I understood him." Amara did not offer comfort, not yet, but she also did not offer cruelty. She simply nodded, recognizing in Sienna's voice an echo of something she herself had felt many years earlier, back when Graham's attention had first made her feel chosen above everyone else. Slowly, cautiously, the two women began working together, not out of friendship, but out of shared necessity. They needed the truth, and neither could uncover it alone. They compiled a list of accounts, cross-referenced dates, matched Graham's stories against the paper trail left behind by years of financial maneuvering. A pattern began to take shape beneath their careful work. Graham was not simply carrying debt. He was using new loans to pay off older ones, a cycle that had clearly been spinning for years, each rotation larger and more desperate than the last. It was not the behavior of a man building wealth. It was the behavior of a man running from collapse, moving fast enough that he never had to look directly at what was chasing him. Then, Sienna found something that stopped their progress entirely. A large transfer of funds moved out of one of Graham's accounts to a recipient neither of them recognized. Not Graham himself, not the company he claimed to run, a third party, entirely. A name that meant nothing to either woman. Together they traced the unfamiliar name back to an investment firm that had once partnered with Graham years earlier, long before Amara had ever heard the company mentioned. Graham had used the firm's name and reputation to move money in ways neither woman could immediately understand, layering transaction upon transaction until the original source of the funds became nearly impossible to trace. Walter Briggs, reviewing the same trail a few days later, confirmed what both women had begun to suspect. The firm in question had quietly dissolved years earlier after a string of failed ventures, yet its name continued to appear on documents long after it ceased any real operation. Graham had kept the shell alive on paper, using it as a kind of financial mirror, a place to reflect obligations that would otherwise have appeared directly under his own name. It was, Walter explained, a common enough trick among people determined to outrun their own mistakes, though rarely one sustained for as many years as Graham had managed. But the deeper motive behind it all proved more painful than the mechanics of the fraud itself. Years earlier, before Sienna, before even the peak of the life Amara remembered, Graham had lost a significant sum in a failed investment. Rather than admit the failure, rather than face the consequences honestly, he had borrowed to cover the loss, then borrowed again to cover that borrowing. Each failure buried beneath a fresh layer of debt, each layer requiring a larger loan to conceal the one beneath it. The house, the cars, the dinners, none of it had ever represented real wealth. It had been a carefully maintained illusion, propped up by an ever-growing foundation of obligation. Amara sat with this realization for a long time, turning it over slowly. She had not spent 16 years married to a successful man who eventually grew bored of her. She had spent 16 years standing beside a carefully constructed performance, one she had never been allowed to see behind. Walter eventually pieced together the timeline with unsettling precision. The original failed investment had occurred nearly a decade earlier, a venture into commercial real estate that had collapsed almost immediately after Graham committed a significant portion of the firm's capital. Rather than disclose the loss to his partners or clients, Graham had quietly borrowed against a separate account to cover the shortfall, telling himself, presumably, that he would recover the money before anyone noticed. He never did. Instead, each subsequent year brought a new gap to cover, a new loan to secure it, a new story to explain away the widening distance between appearance and reality. Amara remembered that period vaguely now, recalling a stretch of months when Graham had seemed unusually tense, prone to sudden irritability over small things that had never bothered him before. At the time, she had attributed it to work stress, the ordinary pressures of running a business. She had comforted him during those months, reassured him, given him space to work through whatever he told her he was facing. She understood now that she had been comforting a man already deep inside a lie he had no intention of ever sharing with her. The final piece of the puzzle explained something that had confused her from the very beginning. Graham had not left simply because he fell for a younger woman. He had left because he needed to begin building his illusion again, somewhere fresh, with someone who did not yet know the history buried beneath his charm. Sienna was younger, less familiar with his past, more likely to believe the story he told rather than question the numbers behind it. He had underestimated both of them. He had assumed Amara would remain too devastated to look closely, and that Sienna would remain too dazzled to look at all. Instead, both women had turned their attention toward the truth, methodically, patiently, refusing to let his carefully built narrative stand unchallenged. Amara discovered the final loan buried in the stack of documents, larger than any of the others, more dangerous than any of the others. The collateral listed against it was the house she still lived in, the home she had built her adult life inside of. Graham had put everything at risk without ever telling her, without ever giving her the chance to protect what remained of her own security. A few days later, Graham appeared unannounced at her front door, his usual confidence noticeably diminished. He asked her to sign a set of documents, insisting it was the only way to protect the house from what was coming. Amara studied him for a long moment, before refusing outright. "Why did you not tell me about the debt?" she asked, her voice calm despite the storm building behind her composure. Graham's temper flared quickly. He blamed her for not understanding the pressure he carried, insisted that everything he had done had been for the future they once shared. He reminded her of the early years, of the sacrifices he claimed to have made building the life she had once enjoyed without question, as though gratitude might now soften the consequences he was trying to avoid. Amara felt the old pull of it, the familiar instinct to smooth things over, to find some quiet compromise that would make the discomfort disappear. She recognized the instinct for what it was this time, and she let it pass through her without taking hold. Amara listened without flinching, then answered him with a steadiness that seemed to surprise them both. "You did not protect our future," she told him. "You protected your image." Graham realized, perhaps for the first time, that Amara understood far more than he had assumed. He shifted quickly, toward threats of legal consequence, hoping intimidation might succeed where charm had failed. But Amara had already prepared. She had an attorney. She had copies of every relevant document. And most importantly, she no longer feared him the way she once had. It was in that moment that Sienna arrived, standing quietly at the edge of the porch. Graham turned toward her immediately, attempting to convince her that Amara was manipulating the situation, twisting facts to serve her own interests. Sienna said nothing at first. Then she lifted her phone, revealing recordings she had quietly kept of conversations Graham had assumed no one would ever hear. "I know what you did," Sienna told him, her voice steady, despite the tremor beneath it. For the first time since Amara had known him, Graham looked genuinely afraid. In the weeks that followed, Denise Coleman worked methodically to protect Amara's interests. Financial records were reviewed with careful attention, separating Graham's personal obligations from those Amara might legitimately bear responsibility for. Suspicious transactions were flagged and investigated. Amara did not seek to destroy Graham's life entirely, though she certainly could have made that choice. Instead, she simply stopped protecting the secrets he had built his entire identity around. Denise explained the process patiently, walking Amara through each step so that nothing felt hidden or rushed the way so much of her marriage once had. Certain guarantees Amara had signed without full understanding could be challenged on the grounds that Graham had misrepresented their purpose. Other obligations, tied more directly to jointly held property, would require negotiation. But negotiation from a position far stronger than the one Amara had occupied only weeks earlier, back when she had no documentation and no ally willing to speak the truth alongside her. Walter's forensic report proved invaluable during this stage, laying out in precise, unemotional language exactly how Graham had structured his obligations over the years. Bank representatives, who had once dealt exclusively with Graham, now found themselves speaking directly with Amara and her attorney, reviewing a paper trail that left little room for the kind of persuasive charm Graham had always relied upon in difficult conversations. For the first time in years, The numbers spoke louder than his voice. There were setbacks along the way. One creditor initially pushed to hold Amara jointly responsible for a business loan she had never knowingly agreed to guarantee, and for a brief, the frightening stretch of weeks, it seemed possible she might lose far more than she had already lost. Denise fought the claim methodically, presenting evidence of the misleading circumstances under which the original signature had been obtained. Eventually, the creditor withdrew its position, and Amara felt, for the first time since the night Graham left, something that resembled solid ground beneath her feet again. This shift marked something important in who Amara had become. For years she had stayed quiet to preserve a marriage she believed was worth protecting. Now she spoke the truth openly, not out of vengeance, but because silence had cost her enough already. Protecting herself finally mattered more than protecting an illusion that had never truly included her. Sienna, too, faced the consequences of choices she had made without full understanding. She admitted, quietly and without excuse, that she had been drawn in by the surface of a life that looked successful and secure. But she also recognized clearly now that Graham had deliberately hidden the truth from her, just as he had hidden it from Amara for years before that. During one of their final conversations, Sienna asked Amara a question that had clearly been weighing on her for some time. "Do you hate me?" she asked quietly. Amara considered the question honestly before answering. "I hated what happened," she said. "I do not have to hate you." It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was something close to peace, an acknowledgement that both women had been navigating the same deception from different angles. One final document surfaced during the last stage of the investigation, proof that Graham had attempted to shift a portion of his financial responsibility directly onto Amara without her knowledge or consent. Had she not chosen to look closely, had she accepted his warning to leave the finances alone, she might have found herself burdened with obligations that were never rightfully hers to carry. Amara set the document down carefully on the table in front of her. "Now he gets to face what he created," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone listening. Months passed. Amara's life slowly transformed into something steadier, something built on truth rather than performance. She no longer felt the need to prove herself better than Sienna, nor did she feel compelled to prove Graham wrong to anyone who might be watching. Her energy shifted instead toward rebuilding, toward creating a foundation that belonged entirely to her. The house was secured through the legal process Denise had guided her through, its ownership finally protected from the debts Graham had quietly attached to it. Her personal finances were separated cleanly from anything connected to his name. For the first time in years, Amara understood exactly where she stood, without ambiguity, without hidden accounts, without someone else controlling the numbers behind her life. She began building something new from the wreckage of what she had learned. A consulting practice aimed at helping people who had discovered, often far too late, that a partner had hidden serious financial problems from them. Her own experience became the foundation of expertise she could offer others, navigating similar betrayals, women and men alike, who had trusted someone completely, only to discover the ground beneath them had never been solid. The first client who walked through her door reminded Amara, uncomfortably, of herself only months earlier. A woman in her late 50s, married for nearly 3 decades, had discovered a stack of unfamiliar credit statements hidden in a filing cabinet her husband rarely opened. She arrived at Amara's small office trembling, uncertain whether she was overreacting or finally seeing clearly for the first time in years. Amara recognized the look in her eyes immediately, the particular blend of fear and disbelief that came from realizing a life once thought stable had been quietly hollowed out from underneath. Amara walked her through the same methodical process Walter had once walked her through, teaching her how to read a balance sheet, how to request account histories, how to separate panic from information. She did not promise the woman an easy outcome. She promised her clarity, which, Amara had come to understand, mattered far more than false comfort ever could. Watching the woman leave that first session with a folder of organized documents and a plan for her next steps, Amara felt something settle inside her that had been missing for a very long time, a sense that her own painful education had not been wasted after all. Word spread slowly at first, then more steadily, through attorneys who referred clients her way, and through people who had worked with her directly and trusted her enough to recommend her to others, facing similar circumstances. Amara built her practice on a simple principle she repeated to nearly everyone who sat across from her desk. Silence protects the person hiding something. It rarely protects the person who has been kept in the dark. Graham, meanwhile, faced the consequences of years spent building an illusion rather than a life. There was no dramatic downfall staged for anyone's satisfaction. No elaborate revenge orchestrated by the women he had deceived. There did not need to be. The truth itself, once finally exposed, carried enough weight to unravel everything he had spent years carefully constructing. The investment firm he had once run, with such visible confidence, quietly lost several key clients. Once word of the financial irregularities began to circulate among people who moved in the same professional circles. He sold the car he had once treated as a symbol of his success, and eventually the apartment he had rented for Sienna as well, downsizing into a much smaller life than the one he had spent years pretending to live. He reached out to Amara only once more after their final confrontation, a brief message asking whether there was any way to start over. She did not respond. Some doors, she had come to understand, were not meant to be reopened, simply because the person on the other side finally regretted closing them. Sienna eventually left the apartment Graham had once described as the beginning of their future together. She realized, slowly and painfully, that she had never truly loved the man underneath the performance. She had loved the image he presented, the confidence, the ease, the appearance of a life without struggle. Once that image dissolved, so did whatever she had believed she felt for him. Packing her belongings into a handful of boxes felt strangely anticlimactic after everything that had unfolded. She had imagined, in the earliest days of their relationship, a future filled with the kind of security she had never known growing up. Instead, she found herself starting over in a small apartment across town, rebuilding a life on considerably more modest terms, though with a clarity she had never possessed before. She took a position at a marketing firm where no one asked about her personal finances or her past relationships, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that ordinary stability suited her far better than the borrowed glamour she had once mistaken for love. She and Amara spoke occasionally in the months that followed, brief conversations at first, checking in on how the legal proceedings were unfolding, later drifting into territory that had little to do with Graham at all. Sienna asked once, tentatively, whether Amara thought she would ever trust anyone again after everything that had happened. Amara considered the question seriously, before answering. "Trust does not have to be all or nothing," she said. "You learn to give it in smaller pieces, to people who have actually earned each piece, rather than handing over the whole thing at once and hoping for the best." The two women did not become close friends in the aftermath, their history too complicated for something so simple. But a quiet respect remained between them, born from having faced the same deception together and having chosen honesty over resentment when it would have been easier to turn against each other entirely. On a quiet morning many months later, Amara stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom that was now entirely her own. She removed her wedding ring slowly, without tears, without the dramatic gestures she once imagined such a moment might require. She did not throw it away. She placed it gently into a small box, closing the lid with quiet finality. Looking at her own reflection, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "I did not lose my marriage," she said. A pause followed, long enough to hold 16 years of memory inside it. Then, with a steadiness that surprised even her, she continued. "I am finally getting my life back," she thought, standing there in the quiet of the bedroom, of all the versions of herself she had been over the years. The young woman who had fallen for a charming man with an easy laugh and bigger plans than she had ever imagined for herself. The wife who had learned to stop asking questions because the answers always seemed to come wrapped in reassurance that quietly discouraged further inquiry. The woman who had stood frozen in a hallway one night, certain that humiliation was the heaviest thing she would ever carry. None of those versions had disappeared entirely. They had simply become part of the foundation for whoever she was becoming now, steadier, clearer, no longer willing to mistake comfort for safety. She stepped outside that morning into early light, spilling gently across the porch, the kind of light that made the world feel briefly new again. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. A message from Sienna waited on the screen. "Thank you for answering my call," it read. Amara smiled faintly. something quiet and genuine settling into her expression. She typed back a simple reply. "You were brave enough to call," she wrote. "That is where the truth began." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking down the front steps, out into a morning that belonged entirely to her. She was not alone in the way loneliness usually feels heavy and hollow. She was alone in a different way now, lighter, steadier, free of the weight she had carried, without realizing it for far too long. What had once felt like an ending revealed itself, slowly and quietly, to be something closer to a beginning, one she had built for herself, out of the wreckage someone else had left behind. In the months that followed, Amara often thought back to the version of herself who had stood frozen in the hallway the night Graham walked out, certain that humiliation was the worst thing she would ever feel. She understood now how wrong that assumption had been, and how much more painful the slow unraveling of trust could be than any single moment of heartbreak. Yet she also understood something else, something she had not expected to learn from any of it. Quiet strength did not announce itself loudly. It did not need revenge to prove its own existence. It simply endured, steady and unshaken, long after everything built on deception had finally been allowed to fall.